Strafing is one of the first things you learn about when rocket jumping. Don't hold W, face forwards, hold A or D, slowly turn your mouse left or right. But there's a lot more hidden detail and nuance to strafing that can use some further explanation. Before we get into that, a quick disclaimer. Everything I'm going to say applies to TF2, especially rocket jumping, but some details won't necessarily apply to other source games, or when using particular items like man treads or base jumper, which impact air control. Also, all this is likely going to make utterly no sense to you unless you've done a little air strafing yourself. If you haven't, I suggest you check out the JA2 Easy Strafe course and come back here once you've completed it. A proper and complete explanation of strafing will require a bit of math, but thankfully the math involved is very visual, so in a video we can just look at some animated arrows. Much, or perhaps even most, of what I'm about to explain in this next segment I learned through this insanely informative Steam guide which covers the math of air strafing. You can think of the next segment as a video format summary of the most important points from this post. The set of ideas I'm about to introduce explains everything there is to know technically about strafing, and I'm going to keep coming back to this later on in the video when I discuss how to apply strafing. Please pause to let stuff sink in, or rewind a little bit and watch again if I lose you. Here's our player. Right now he's mid-air, but he isn't moving horizontally at all. If he presses a combination of WASD keys, he quickly accelerates in the overall direction that they point until he reaches 30 hammer units per second. For clarity, 30 hammer units per second is painfully slow. A Brass Beast Heavy moves significantly faster when revved up. The acceleration though is quite powerful. Here's what it looks like in game with the speed cap removed if a player accelerates forward by holding W. Now to be clear, the speed cap of 30 hammer units per second is a limit on how fast you can go in a particular direction before the source engine stops adding to your velocity in that direction. Misunderstanding the speed cap leads to a lot of misconceptions about air strafing. This speed cap isn't referencing a max speed in TF2, nor does it mean that you're unable to add to your speed mid-air beyond 30 hammer units per second. Now we'll complicate things a little. The player is already moving forward at a speed indicated by this blue arrow, and he's looking straight ahead. When the player presses A to strafe, he accelerates in that direction, same as when he's standing still. When you have less than 30 hammer units per second of speed in a particular direction, you accelerate in that direction until you reach that speed. If he didn't change his aim, he'd stop accelerating once he hits that limit. By changing his aim so he faces the new direction he's going, the player keeps adding more speed to his left and starts to turn in that direction. Note that the way that the speed is added to get the new velocity means that if you strafe efficiently enough, you can add to your speed. It also means that you need to turn more gently if you're moving faster, since the added horizontal velocity has a smaller impact on your overall speed. The player can also slow down sharply by holding S. Relative to the direction S points, his speed is negative, so holding S will accelerate him backwards, meaning he slows down, eventually stops, and ultimately starts moving backwards until he's drifting slowly backwards at 30 hammer units per second. One last detail. Your acceleration is different depending on whether you're moving upwards faster than 250 hammer units per second or not. That 250 threshold is what determines whether you're mid-air if there's a floor below you. For example, if a rocket hits you off to the side but doesn't give you 250 hammer units of vertical speed, you'll stay on the ground. In another example, if you're moving fast enough up a ramp that your vertical speed is more than 250 hammer units per second, you'll glide up it without landing on the ground. When you're in the air and your vertical speed is greater than this 250 hammer unit per second threshold, your strafing acceleration is 4 times as powerful than it is when your speed is below that threshold. This means that players can strafe very aggressively when rising during a jump, such as after a sink. If you're roughly level or falling, you can't turn as effectively. While weaving between walls and platforms may be the most common form of strafing, it's by no means simple. The path you take and when you choose to slow down have a great deal of impact on how good the movement is. Taking too wide a turn around an obstacle is pretty obviously inefficient, but many newer players don't realize that taking too narrow a turn is inefficient too. When you're moving faster, you can't turn as sharply, so by taking a wider turn, you're able to make the turn and keep your speed. Sometimes if the turn you want to make is sharp enough, You'll want to hold S briefly to bleed off some speed, which will allow you to make tighter turns. If you try to take a tight turn without slowing down, you won't be able to overcome your speed and you'll slow down and spin out. Of course, slowing down has some obvious negative consequences, and if done unnecessarily, will in some cases cost you the opportunity to make a jump. Instead of slowing down by holding S, sometimes people will overstrafe. They intentionally start to turn sharply to bleed off speed, but then slow their turn so their speed can catch up to their direction, and they can finish the strafe there. The slower you're moving, the more dramatic an impact strafing has on your speed. Say you're moving forward at 60 hammer units per second, face forwards, and hold D. By the time you hit the speed cap to the right, you're now moving 7 hammer units faster at 67 hammer units per second, over a 10% increase in speed. If instead you're moving at 600 hammer units per second, you only increase to 600.75 hammer units per second, which is a mere 0.125% increase in speed. Of course, in a real jump, you'd move in circles or wiggles to keep getting that tiny boost in speed over and over, which means that if you're moving at 60 hammer units per second, you can potentially multiply your speed several times over to a few hundred hammer units, and if you're moving at 600 hammer units per second, you could potentially increase your speed to around 620 over short distances, or even 700 or more if you're spending enough time midair. Strafing to gain speed has the biggest impact when you're doing a vertical sync jump, because you have the most airtime and the least horizontal speed. But if done correctly, wiggle strafing can get you a touch more distance on any jump, except those where you're already traveling at max vel. Max vel, by the way, is actually a limit on the amount of speed that you can have. You can only travel 3,500 hammer units per second in each coordinate direction, but you can move faster than max vel by traveling in multiple coordinate directions at once, up to 6062 hammer units per second when you're at max vel in the X, Y, and Z axes simultaneously. It's important to be aware that just because it's theoretically possible to gain speed, doesn't mean that you'll always be able to do so in practice. Wiggle strafing takes a good bit of training to learn, just like anything else in rocket jumping, and if done slightly wrong at any point, will likely end up costing you your speed and distance rather than giving you it. An extremely important part of air control is adjusting your horizontal speed mid-jump. This allows you to slow down before you plow into an overhang, prevent a pogo from going out of control, and maintain a perfect speed for some types of sinks. By facing forwards and tapping S briefly, you bleed off speed very quickly. Often a very quick tap is all that you need to save yourself from losing control during pogos, and to a lesser degree wall shots, where going extremely fast you can outrun your rockets and prevent yourself from getting sustainable height. There's often a fear that losing speed will mean that you won't be able to make the jump or you'll go slower, but often by losing a little bit of speed now, you adjust so that you get much more effective rockets, which make you go faster and further long term. There's not much to say about this one, just that you really need to try it out in different scenarios and get used to where it's most effective. It's a super useful tool in your jumping toolkit, and people often don't think about using it. It's totally possible to use keys other than A or D to turn your character, it's just ill advised most of the time. All that matters for strafing is the direction that you're moving in and the direction that your arrow keys are pointing. So if you want to strafe left with W, face 90 degrees from where you're moving, hold W, and turn your mouse left. You'll keep looking to the left of where you're moving, and eventually you'll make a circle around something that you're constantly looking at. For this reason, strafing with W has some applications for aiming at an opponent in-game, even if it's almost never used in jumping. Strafing with W plus A or WD is frequently used during wall pogo, because the directions that you face during wall pogo and the precise aim that you need to have with each shot makes those keys easy to use. You look off at a 45-degree angle so that the keys still point at a 90-degree angle towards your current momentum. Perhaps the most useful alternate strafing method that's used in-game is strafing backwards. Once you're able to strafe forwards pretty well, strafing backwards is surprisingly intuitive. In-game, you rely on map knowledge to retreat to where you want to go, while still being able to watch and possibly shoot at the enemy. While doing jump maps though, facing backwards has almost no utility, so unless you're looking back to pre-fire a rocket for a telesync, or to look at rockets that you've already fired for a sink, make it a habit to strafe while facing forwards when rocket jumping. Hopefully now you have a deep understanding of why strafing works and some ideas of how to apply air control to your advantage. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.